Hi, I'm Noam Wasserman, Dean of the SciSim School of Business at Yeshiva University. I was a longtime professor at Harvard Business School, an entrepreneur, and a venture capitalist. I wrote the bestseller, The Founder's Dilemmas.
And I'm Charlie Harari. I've been working with companies for over 10 years. And that book, The Founder's Dilemmas, and the challenges faced by the 10,000 founders in it is the basis of this podcast. We are delving into the issues faced by startups to help you avoid the pitfalls that claim so many good companies.
Let's get started.
And welcome back to the podcast, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on the Founders Dilemmas podcast. Great to be with you again. And Dean, it's awesome to be back. Thanks so much for all that you do. And what do you have for us today?
Oh, thank you, Charlie. Great to see you again. Last two times, we had taken a look at one of my favorite founders, Lou Cerny, who had founded an enterprise software company, had lots of early success, and because of that success, got fired as CEO of the company.
Right.
So we had taken a look at how does the parent of the baby get fired as the parent, and all the things that lead up to it, a little bit of the aftermath. We're going to delve a little bit more deeply into the aftermath of Lou's story, but also see some of the ways in which his path, in fact, the path that he took after he left the company, gives us lots of insights also into entrepreneurship, and in particular into serial entrepreneurs. The people who get back up on the horse, the people who do more than one company, what leads them to do that? What are the ways in which they can do it more effectively or less effectively? And so being able to understand the multi-venture path is what we want to delve into today.
Right. I think there are people like this. I think when you see some people that struggle mid-company development, right? They're struggling because they don't really understand the concept of serial entrepreneurship. They think that when they start a company, they're supposed to be there to the end. They don't understand yet, and I hope we will explain it to them, that there's a thing called serial entrepreneurs. Like it's a path that people are on where really they don't really make it in the later stages of the company. That's okay. That's not where their strength's at.
Yeah, no, you're actually bringing to mind. I actually have my my Chumash, my Bible right here for Devarim, for Deuteronomy that we're reading right now. And it's actually the flip side of the founder versus the person who takes the ball with him. For the founder, lo alecha hamlacha ligmor. It's not up to you to finish, but you have to start. You have to get the thing going, and sometimes it might be they have to hand over. But in Devarim and Deuteronomy, and this is the beginning of the 8th chapter of it, talks about that if you are the one who finishes, then we attribute the success to you. Kol hamitzvah, the entire one of what you accomplished is what's attributed to you. What we're looking at is the people who maybe should be the starters, but not the continuers. Mm-hmm. And then there's the joiners who then take the ball and get it to the finish line. Mm-hmm. And the two together are what are enabling everything to get to a lot more of the potential in the world. Yep. So yeah, there's being able to tune into that is one of the key things about founders having the self-awareness about their both. We have talked about the need, the can, and the want. Founders a lot of times have to tune into all of those. But in particular, the want, do I even like it when it gets to a larger company? Do I have the skills that I need to? Sometimes it's give it to someone else who has the can better than you and who has rejuvenated the want in ways that you've lost it. And so those are two of the things that have to interact here in the ongoing development of each of these startups that we're looking at.
Right.
So to get into, let's pick up with a little bit of Lou's story. We talked about how in the end, he had to give up the reins. He actually negotiated a little bit on the financial side to make sure that he was going to be able to be whole, if you will, from it. And so making a different trade-off of giving up control for it. In the end, he gave up the reins to someone who was named Richard Williams. And when we take a look at what are the effects that has on company value, Lou said that in general, he thinks that he could have grown it to about a $50 to $60 million exit, being able to sell that for that value, selling it to a larger company. In the end, Richard Williams, with the things that he brought to the table, experienced operator, very much knowing what you need to have a company get to the finish line with and things like that. He led them to a $375 million exit.
Wow.
So 6 times as big as what Lou admits that he was going to be able to achieve within the company. And so it gives you some kind of a feel for when the founder gives up the control, as long as it's to the right person and done in the right way, that it can really maximize the potential within the company. And in a lot of ways, the power of giving up the kingship to become richer, both at the company level, having it achieve its potential, and then also individually for the founder. However, Lou had all sorts of regrets after that, despite heading more into the rich direction. When he came to class, when he visited class, the last thing that he said was that next time I am growing it to $1 billion, and I don't care what any venture capitalist has to say about it. So loads of regret that he had about the early choices he had made to be able to finance it, about the ways he had not been set up with the strategies he had chosen and the other things like that to have it fit what he was going to be able to do for the long run. And we'll be able to see when we get to the next stage of his multi-venture escapade, that we'll be able to see how he was able to harness a bunch of those lessons. Essentially, when founders are leaving the company, when they sell the company, and we're going to see this in a future episode on exits, when they are important to the company, the acquirer doesn't want them to disappear. They know that we're going to lose something if the founder disappears. And so they try to put financial handcuffs, golden handcuffs, on the founder. And so Lou had a 2-year lockup. He would have to earn some of the exit money by sticking around for a couple of years, continuing to contribute in some form to the company. However, what he did, very smart, he took that time to reflect on the path that he had taken, on the decisions he had made, on the places that it had taken him in the end, where it wasn't quite fitting. Like, so there was the regret that he had. And so reflecting on what were the key decisions, what are the lessons for next time around. And in particular, I had a couple of long conversations with him in which we broke down the key decisions, how he might make different ones the next time around. Were they going to be consistent with each other in terms of being able to get him to a different outcome than he had then? And so he used that time very wisely to be able to learn from it. And so let's first, before we return to what Lou did with his next venture, let's look at more generally at serial entrepreneurs. There's some serial entrepreneurship research that's been coming out in recent years that has some intriguing outcomes, some intriguing findings for people. So let me give you a little bit of the context for this. I was teaching a case in my Founders Dilemmas course on a serial team, a team that had gone together through 4 different ventures. Pretty rare animal. Usually it's a single solo entrepreneur who's going through it, might have different founders each time that he's co-founding with. But this is a team that I'd gone through at each of the stages of the way. And their 4th company was something called FeedBurner. And the core of it, the CEO, was someone named Dick Costello. He started out as a computer scientist, some fun things with Dick that we'll see a little bit later. He put on hold his career when he graduated college to do improv. That was his other passion. He went to Chicago, did a bunch of things around scratching that itch before he then headed back into the tech sector and founded some companies with his prior co-founders. And what we were looking at in that case study when we were discussing in class was the path that he had taken, which is a bit of a like the path through the 4 ventures. So let me tap first before we get back into some of the outcomes of that. There had been a guest in that class that day at Harvard. Once in a while, I would have guests come by and say, "Can I come watch class?" The end of that class, the guest comes charging down into the pit, as we call it, the center of the classroom. And he says to me, "This is my research." Like, we hadn't even set him up with that class or anything like that, but random draw. Turns out he was a PhD student in Copenhagen named Rasmus Toft, and he was studying serial entrepreneurs. And so I said, I would love to learn more about what kinds of things you're learning about them. And so he sent me the paper that he was working on at that point, came out, was published a couple of years later. And so let's get into the core finding that he had. So you have a serial entrepreneur who performs at whatever level in the first venture. How well do you think, if that person goes on to do a second venture, how well, Charlie, do you think that person is going to be able to perform in the next venture?
I would think high.
Okay, it's going to go up. How well do you think it's going to happen in the next venture?
The third one?
Yeah.
I would think it go, depending on whether that an entrepreneur has deliberate practice in their veins. I would think that they would continuously, at some point before, the returns start to diminish, they would continually get better and better. Smarter and smarter.
And a lot of investors think the same way. They're looking for the been there, done that. He's had some experience. Even if she didn't succeed in the venture, I'll bet on her because she's already paid a tuition bill and learned from it. Right. Other things like that they're going and thinking through it. What Rasmus's data showed is that you have this performance in the first venture. The performance in the second venture is this.
Goes down.
And then in the third venture, goes up a little bit, but it's not at the same level of the first. It's only in the 4th venture that it then approximates how well they were doing in the first venture. And to me, it's fascinating. And it did also come through in that FeedBurner case. that we were taking a look at. It was very much a zigzagging path that they took to their success in FeedBurner, the fourth of their ventures. And so to me, it sparked all sorts of intriguing thoughts that I had about why do we take for granted that there's going to be learning that the founders are going to be doing, that there's going to be all sorts of ways in which it's going to culminate. They're going to go Michael El Chayil from strength to strength in everything that they are doing. And there's some of the results that Rasmus had in that paper that help us understand that a little bit. When the founder in the second venture heads to a different industry or heads to a different geography, then the performance goes down. Essentially, they're restarting the learning.
Yep.
They're heading into a different arena where they might even also be applying the learning that doesn't apply to this new event, this new arena, or they are just not even realizing that they're resetting the clock and are going to have to start over more as a first-time founder than as a serial entrepreneur for that. If they wait longer, if they go to the beach for longer in between these ventures, also the decay on the learning, there's all sorts of ways in which the world would have changed more, that they would have been in tune with it. And so all sorts of ways in which, for me, it shaped a lot more of the thoughts that I have in terms of looking at serial entrepreneurs in a different light.
I wonder if it has to do with also the business, like the underlying business. Meaning I can see before you start your first company, a certain passion, a certain level of deliberation. You're scared to jump out. You ask everybody what they think. There's a certain connection to the thing itself. It's your passion. Like I wonder if venture one is both better attuned to the market and better attuned to yourself. And then once you exit, there may be some level of overconfidence. I know how to do this. And so as a result, they're not as careful to what their next venture is and if the market really needs it, because they're maybe relying too much on the fact that they know how to do it now. And the onus is more on them than on the product or the market. I wonder if that's a factor. I can almost imagine an entrepreneur with an exit, whereas he may have never dreamed of that level of money. And I see this a lot in the business world when you look at like larger companies making bets, because in many ways there are people that work in big companies that are just entrepreneurs, right? They don't need multiple investors, right? They have a company, so they buy this project and that project, or this business and that business. It's all under one roof. And you see after a big exit, the next one or two, the deals they do, the projects they do, the licenses they sign, they're not the best. And I think part of that is because they're feeling good about themselves. They think they can do it, and they forget how hard it is to make something work.
Yeah, so you're getting into two things in terms of like all the follow-up thoughts and the research that I've done on some of the serial entrepreneurs. You're separating out between, did they succeed in the first venture or did they fail in the first venture?
Right,
and
right.
Each of those has an Achilles heel that it introduces. So back to a bunch of the themes that we've had throughout the podcast. Passion, is it all a promise and a plus, or are there perils to it? This is another one where regardless of whether you succeeded or you failed the first time around in your venture, it actually introduces some perils. It actually introduces problems. You were highlighting the unexpected perils maybe of success, overconfidence. That means that you're not going to be watching as much as you did in the first venture for where do I have to adjust? Where am I off in my idea? Other things along those lines. And then also when it comes to the failure side of it, what happens when you get burned? You go to the stove, your hand gets burned. Do you want to go anywhere near the stove?
Right.
You're going to overreact in the direction of being too cautious. You're going to overcorrect in the wrong direction. The pendulum is going to overswing to the other side of it. And so each of those has some perils about if you're not learning right, if you're not really separating out, what are the key lessons that are solid ones for me to take from this? And instead you overcorrect or you overconfident. Then there's all sorts of ways that's what's going to lead to, in each of those scenarios, worse performance in the second venture.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I totally agree. And you see this also in people's lives, in terms of jobs, and they get their first job and how they make the decision for the second job. And you're seeing some of the data that we're finding with the Great Resignation that we're going through now, where, lots of people that have left their jobs are now upset and they regret leaving. So a lot of, like you're saying, a lot of either the overconfidence or the overcautiousness of the previous experience, job, venture, whatever, really creates biases to the next move. And I think before making that move, I think what you're bringing up, which is critical when whoever's listening, to understand that, first of all, people think that the grass is always greener, when I get out of the hairs of this venture capitalist and I can run my own company that I'm self-funding, it's going to be easy, right? When I move out of office and I go to retail, it's going to be easy, right? When I get out of this job and go to the next job, it'll be there's a certain bias towards where you're going, and if you're not aware of it, you're going to make bad decisions or not as good decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. So the second thing that we were teeing up before, in addition to separating out initial success versus initial failure, also came to mind with my having like we were talking just now about Deuteronomy of Devarim being right here. Next thing that comes to mind, this is Rashi, the all-time great commentator. This is talking in chapter 11, verse 10. Talks about it's the way of the world that a person first builds that which is nicest, and afterwards he builds that which is inferior. And essentially, it's taking a look. There's a couple of levels of it. You have a bunch of ideas. Which one are you going to pursue first? So you were talking about the one I'm most passionate about, the one that I think is the highest potential and other things like that. He's going to pick that one first. Also, Rashi highlights that also in terms of the resources you're going to bring to it. If you have like a pool of initial resources, you're going to devote the best resources to that initial venture. And then everything after that is going to be the inferior resources, the worst ones that you're going to be bringing to it. Maybe it is you're taking your best potential co-founder to do the first one with you. And then that one you weren't that excited about with the next venture, but okay, it'll be good enough for, being able to do the second round with me. Or it might be other ways in which you're having the inferior that is going to be I used the best before. That's another one of the psychology of serial entrepreneurship that Rashi is getting into that we might also be able to see there. So let me introduce now the second of the serial entrepreneurs that we'll bring into this episode to be able to shed some new light on some of the pieces of this. And then we'll come back around to Lou's story and see some of where that went. In terms of this one, this is going to be an entrepreneur whose name is Evan Williams. So Evan was the original founder of what was called Blogger, the pioneer in the blogging realm. He also then, after he exited from Blogger, founded something called Odeo, which was one of the podcasting pioneers. Ironic, as we're doing this. That was back in the era. He essentially introduced it, and then podcasting became word of the year. Merriam-Webster, I think it was, who declares word of the year, or the Oxford Dictionary, something like that. And so very big, very high-flying at that point. What that one then did was morph into something that is a very common, almost daily occurrence in our lives that we'll get into as we see how it changed. But let's get back into Blogger and Odeo. Evan in Blogger and Odeo, and I worked with him on a pretty deep case study on him and his different approaches to this. In each of them, he took a very different approach. We had talked a couple of episodes ago about the more control-oriented approach that the kings, the queens take with their ventures, and contrasting that to giving up the reins to the best people who are going to be able to help you make decisions and other things like that, the more rich approach, if you will. In the first of them, in Blogger, Evan went king. So much so that he brought in a bunch of his friends. When they did not agree with his decisions, he essentially said, I'm calling the shots here. And they disappeared, and he was left all alone. The king literally on his throne with no subjects around him. That was how much he wanted to control the vision. His vision for that was that we're going to democratize communication. That's what blogs were going to enable for it. And everyone else was saying we have to be charging for this product. We're not going to be able to build a sustainable business without it. And Evan was like, that's going to harm our being able to have it go everywhere and be able to achieve my vision and things like that. And so all sorts of ways in which Evan in that venture went the control direction. When it came to Odeo, he went in the opposite direction. With Odeo, he went for the big money because this is now the big time, the word of the year. There's lots of money that's being offered out there. He tried to raise $1 million. He got offered $5 million because it was such a hot space. All sorts of ways in which he was brought into the rich realm, even though he really wanted to keep control of things. And at the end of it, he really regretted it. He had all sorts of problems because of his inviting in those investors, because of all the other decisions he had made. He tuned into, as this serial entrepreneur, he hadn't realized how control-oriented he was until he had experienced both of the models. And then realized after that, I have to go and take a very different approach than I did at Odeo to what I'm doing next. What he did next was founded Twitter. And so he took a bunch of these lessons they had learned, and we'll see Lou in a lot of detail. What do you learn as a control-oriented person, but who also wants to build something big? when you haven't been able to do the combination of the two, rich and king, within your first couple of ventures, how, as the serial entrepreneur, can you harness a bunch of those lessons as you're heading into it? And so he had all sorts of ways in which he was able to then culminate a bunch of the things that he was doing when he was founding Twitter. The idea for Twitter came from someone named Jack Dorsey, who was in his team within Odeo. Evan, at the time when they were founding it, he became the founder and chairman, and he gave the reins to Jack at first. When it started growing, and he realized that Jack was not the right one to be on this rocket ship, being able to grow that company. Jack had never really even managed much of a project team before, let alone a large company and all the things that went into what he was going to have to do to be able to grow it. And so the way in which he made very different decisions, he essentially replaced Jack as CEO and stepped in. Wow. And then after a couple of years, Evan leading, harnessing all the lessons that he had learned and harnessing that for being able to grow Twitter, I got an interesting request from, we had talked about Dick Costello, the founder of FeedBurner before. I got an interesting request from Dick. Dick said, Noam, I hear that you wrote a case on Evan. Can you please send it to me? He's talking to me about coming on board within his Twitter team. Intriguing. Like Dick was doing his due diligence on Evan. And it was also interesting. One of my students captured it when I was giving them a little bit of the case update afterwards. He said, this is the founder's dilemma is imperialism. You know, the protagonists coming together to conquer the world together. Right. And so he did his due diligence on Evan. He wanted to understand the control-oriented founder, what lessons did Evan learn, and other things like that. Read through the case to be able to come up to speed on it. Evan ended up bringing on Dick as COO on September 14th, 2009.
Wow.
And so his right-hand man within the venture. One of the other key lessons that we're going to see that Lou Cerny learned when it came to bringing in the next person. Great thing, and this is where I was mentioning to you about Dick's past as an improv comedian. On the day before he came on board on September 13th, he tapped a little bit of it, and I could just imagine how a bunch of people outside would have panicked to see this because they didn't understand who it was coming from. Dick's tweet the day before he started was, my first full day as Twitter COO tomorrow. Task number 1, undermine CEO, consolidate power.
Great.
Classic Dick, tweet there. But anyone seeing that, if this had been a public company, that stock would have tanked immediately.
Forget about it, right?
Things like that. But then a year later, lo and behold, Evan shocked the world by stepping down as CEO and handing the reins to Dick.
Right.
And so Dick became the next CEO of Twitter. And then 4 months later, when you are the control-oriented founder and you've given over the throne and things like that, would it be good for you to stick around? Is it something that you would even want to do? So 4 months later, Evan left, decided it was better not to share the throne. And we also saw with Richard Williams, who came in after Lou Cerny at Wiley and things like that, how it's going to be tough for the new person to really take control. And that's why he didn't want Lou to continue as chairman of the board and other things like that. And so Dick, it was very interesting. We started off talking about the people who start and then they don't have to continue and go beyond their capabilities. More. But then also there's the joiner who's able to take it further, and how sometimes those are quite different skills. Dick in some ways made the rare move from being the founder across 4 ventures to then being the CEO succeeding the founder in a later stage venture. And we talked about the major differences in can and want, but Dick was the rare person who was able to head on to do both.
Wow.
And so that's being able to layer in like some other insights, the gaining the self-awareness from the multi-venture path that you're taking through it, harnessing it to act on that learning, making the learning better and more conscious, more intentional than the founders who go into the next venture and plummet in terms of their performance and other things like that. That Evan was able to embody a bit because of his being able to learn from that.
Yeah, maybe we should really delve into this on a future episode, but to me it feels very much that the underlying theme here is this constant path of self-awareness, meaning you can easily see how founders get burnt and don't learn and become bitter and start knocking out industry 1, and it's the venture capitalists, and industry 2, it's the people underneath me, and you can literally see how they can literally go career as a serial entrepreneur, and it's always someone else's fault, never fully getting their balance of, of rich king. Whereas a person who recognizes, and this applies I think in everywhere in business, but in particular in the area of a serial entrepreneur, that they're really looking at their businesses as environments to learn about themselves, right? This is just a business in a it's almost like a playground or an exercise room in which to understand your own muscle composition and know how to target your own muscles. And if you do that and you learn about that as you go further down in your serial entrepreneurship, or if you're a CEO of a company, as you go further down in your own development of your company, right? Because a lot of what you do every day, especially if I know we're going to talk about this in the future, if you grow by acquisition or you do other things within a company, there's entrepreneurialism in regular corporations. And I see this all the time. The awareness, the self-awareness of knowing how to hand it over, who to hand it over, when to hand it over, when to stay, when to leave, what you are good at, what you're not good at, right? And how to bring that all around. To me, it very much feels, and I know that we're taping this in the month of Elul, which is the month that we're supposed to be preparing ourselves for the high holidays and engaging in self-awareness. It very much feels to me that the world of entrepreneurship, if done right, is a world of self-introspection and self-awareness. And that really is the secret sauce of great entrepreneurs, is that they get underneath it and they emerge a much more in touch, aware person.
Yeah, no, you're also bringing to mind, both between the LO part and the serial entrepreneurship part, about when you hit a bump in the road, do you attribute it to external factors or do you attribute it to yourself? And being able to be frank with yourself and really assess which of those brings to mind. So there's a professor at NYU named JP Eggers. He did some entrepreneurship research on serial entrepreneurs. And what he found in that paper published a few years ago, that entrepreneurs whose previous venture failed, they were more likely to blame the external environment. And because of that, they would change industries, blame the industry rather than you're being able to learn the industry. And then as we saw with Rasmus Toft's research, you change industries and it tanks you even more.
Right.
And so all sorts of ways in which that industry change was very costly, and it invalidated the learning that they should have had about the prior industry, and to reset the clock for them to heading into all over again, having to learn and things like that. So let me just bring back around to Lou Cerny to finish the story with that. So Lou, after reflecting on what he should do differently, decided to found the next venture within the same industry, a different approach that he was using that enabled him to be able to start what would be essentially a competitor, but in a different domain for it, but leveraging a lot of the learning and things like that. He started something called New Relic, which when he said to me, I was like, first, hey, that's a great oxymoron, two conflicting things that are coming together, new and relic. And then I thought for a second, wait, Lou, that's brilliant. It's an anagram for his name. If you take Lou Cerny and mix around the letters, Lou is actually a very humble guy, as we talked about, Canadian for one thing, but also lots of anava, lots of humble spirits within him. And I was like, Lou, a lot of times founders put their name on the door, when they want to have it be the mark on society that they'll have. You've hidden it within an anagram, like no one's going to know, but your name is on the door. That's brilliant. So a way to balance humility with being able to have that name there. But Lou changed on all sorts of dimensions how he was founding New Relic compared to what he did with Wiley. And so when it came to the strategy that he pursued, when it came to the people that were going to be needed to pursue that strategy, when it came to who he looked to hire, when it came to the outside capital, when it came to the investors he tapped, and also more recently, the succession that he went through, changed it on all of those. So Wiley, the strategy was very sales intensive. That's a new area for Lou. We talked about how he had to buy his first suit, all sorts of ways in which it was a real challenge for him to be able to keep up with the strategic and the challenges and things like that. With New Relic, he did software as a service. It was in his sweet spot, he said, to be able to have that technological approach to it. He needed to have more than a third of Wiley be salespeople. In New Relic, he had 20 non-salespeople as his employees before he needed the first salesperson because it was software as a service. The hires, he was able to tap some prior relationships, but otherwise it was mostly strangers that he was bringing in, people he didn't really know how well they do and scale and things like that. For New Relic, handpicked his prior employees, the best ones from the crop there. In some ways, going against Rashi, saying that you're going to have to go in the next venture to the inferior resources, being able to cherry pick. the best of them. Outside capital, do you think he went and got the venture capitalist, the rock star venture capitalist who fired him the first time around?
I don't think so.
No. But what he said was, I want to go and get someone else's money to be able to do this with it, but I'm willing to self-fund if I can't get my own terms. He had made enough money out of the first venture that he could do that, be able to give him that leeway for it. And so he was able to negotiate much better terms in the next time around. He also went to the junior venture capitalist on the board who had helped build some value, but also not be, the father figure who fired him on the board there. And so he handpicked his peer VC and other things like that. And then he approached New Relic very differently, and it became a rock star of a company in the industry. Wow. He led it to, there's going to be a future topic of ours about leading it to an exit in terms of the public markets. But he led New Relic to a public offering, becoming it to an IPO. Wow. It became a very big company in the industry. At the IPO, he owned 27% of the company still. Several multiples of what he owned in percentage terms of Wiley when it was at its acquisition. Last check I had, New Relic was worth $4 billion.
Wow.
And this is the power of harnessing the lessons, reflecting and being intentional about really tuning into yourself and all the other things there. A year ago, Lou stepped down as the CEO. That was back in June 2021. He transitioned it to someone named Bill Staples, who he had brought in as chief product officer a few years before. Later promoted him to president and CPO, and then promoted him to CEO. He was able to see him in progressive roles, be able to develop a relationship, not what he had with Richard Williams, someone in from the outside, no relationship coming on board or anything like that. He was able to date him as a future CEO before he had the company marry him as a CEO and things like that. And so a very different approach that he took even to the succession within there. But again, a critical way as a serial entrepreneur, if you are the typical one where your performance is going to go down because you haven't learned the right lessons, you can have a very different path that you can have, just like Evan and Lou were able to do on their way to being able to harness a lot of the lessons and a lot of the power of being a serial entrepreneur.
Amazing. What incredible lessons here.
Yeah, so just next time around, before you go to your takeaways, want to tease a little bit. Next time around, I want to look at one other serial entrepreneur. He is a rock star within the Jewish serial entrepreneurship realm. A Rab named Rab Noach Weinberg Zatzal, who founded one of the most important of all Jewish organizations over the last 50 years, something called Eshet Torah. And I want to take a look at his path that he took through it, because it embodies also a lot of the things that we have here and adds on several other lessons for us.
Yeah, this is an incredible piece, and just learning these lessons of self-awareness and knowing where you stand and knowing how to learn from the mistakes properly versus making the wrong mistakes again and again allows the story of Lou is just unbelievable, how he was able to actually draw the lessons and then create the adaptations, which we should talk about in a future episode. Like, the idea of learning and conditioning, right? I just spoke about this on my podcast just a few days ago. The idea that we have this concept in Torah called V'yadata hayom v'hashivos el vavecha, right? Knowledge and application of that knowledge are two entirely different domains. And I think in many ways it's the underlying theme here, right? Knowing how to learn from the failures and from the successes so that you don't go from the venture dropping in your success and then being able to apply that. And this is the story, the Lou story is unbelievable in that his ability to not only know it and say, not only know it and teach it, not only know it and share it, but to actually figure out how to apply it, how to now go out and make the difference. That's incredible. So you've been listening to the Founders Dilemmas podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in. And next time we've got a great episode on the greatest Jewish serial entrepreneur. So you'll check that out next time. Thanks so much for joining us, and we can't wait to see you next time.